Today's episode is brought to you by the Daily Gardener Friday newsletter. You can sign up for the newsletter over at thedailygardener.org. Hi there, and welcome to The Daily Gardener, a podcast about garden history and literature. I'm your host, Jennifer Ebling, and today is May 5th. Today in garden history, we celebrate the birthday of the late Victorian scholar, schoolmaster, poet, and theologian from the Isle of Man, Thomas Edward Browne, who was born on this day, May 5th in 1830. Thomas was published under T.E. Browne, and here's a little excerpt from his poem called My Garden. A garden is a lovesome thing, God-wot, rose-plot, fringed pool, ferned grot, the various school of peace, and yet the fool contends that God is not. Not God in gardens when the eve is cool? Nay, but I have a sign. 'Tis very sure God walks in mine. And today is the birthday of the English poet and clergyman Richard Watson Dixon, who was born on this day, May 5th in 1833. Richard was the son of the clergyman Dr. James Dixon, and he's most remembered for that melodious poem that begins, "The feathers of the willow are half of them grown yellow." But today I thought I would share an excerpt from his little-known poem called The Judgment of May. Come to the judgment, golden threads, upon golden hair in rich array. Many a chestnut shakes its heads, many a lupine at this day. Many a white rose in our beds waits the judgment of the May. So there you go, a little poem about May called The Judgment of May by Richard Watson Dixon. And today we also celebrate the birthday of an American journalist, novelist, essayist, and poet, Christopher Morley, who was born on this day, May 5th in 1890. Christopher also produced plays and gave college lectures. And in addition to all of that, he wrote little sayings like, "The trouble with wedlock is that there's not enough wed and too much lock." And he also wrote, "Heavy hearts like heavy clouds in the sky are best relieved by the letting of a little water." And then finally, here's one on spring. April prepares her green traffic light, and the world thinks, go. Very true. And today we also celebrate the birthday of the English codebreaker and garden historian, Mavis Lillian Batey, who was born on this day, May 5th in 1921. Mavis served as an English codebreaker during World War II, and her unique skill set allowed her to break the German Enigma code, which allowed the Allied forces to stage their D-Day invasion. Mavis became a champion for forgotten yet historically significant English gardens. She also helped establish garden history as an academic specialty. In 1955, Mavis and her codebreaker husband Keith settled on a farm in Surrey, and it was this property that sparked Mavis's passion for landscape history. After moving to Oxford, Mavis and her family lived in a fantastic park designed by Capability Brown. The park was also home to a garden designed by William Mason in 1775. Mavis recalled, "We lived in the agent's house, right in the middle of Capability Brown Park, but it was William Mason's garden that really got me. We had to cut our way into it. It was all overgrown, and garden ornaments were buried in the grass. I knew at once it wasn't just an ordinary derelict garden. Someone had tried to say something there." Well, Mavis Batey used her wit and determination to become a force in numerous conservation organizations and missions. In 1985, Mavis was honored with the RHS Veitch Memorial Medal for her invaluable work preserving gardens that would otherwise have been lost to time. It's time to grow that garden library with today's book, The Magical World of Moss Gardening by Annie Martin. This book came out in 2015, and Pacific Northwest Magazine said this about Annie's book. Instead of eradicating this deer-resistant, pest-resistant, rootless, stemless wonder of a plant, Annie Martin tells us how to encourage and cultivate it. Well, mosses are near and dear to many gardeners' hearts, and there have been many gardeners who try to grow and cultivate moss to no avail. And that's because moss has some special requirements. Annie writes, "In my own garden, I feel angst when mosses dry out, and I obsessively respond to my compelling desire to give them a rejuvenating drink. And as they begin the saturation process, I regain my own glowing state as I watch leaves swiftly unfold and colors magically intensify." Well, in addition to being mesmerizing, there are many reasons to pursue moss gardening. There are many environmental benefits. Mosses can be a lawn substitute depending on where you live and your garden setup. But if you have a shady property, then you should definitely look into mosses as an option for you. They're super carbon sequesters. They're great at erosion control and flood mitigation, and they have a built-in filtration system. And that means that mosses can help reclaim land in locations where cleanup is needed. Now, if Annie's name sounds familiar, it's because she is a moss expert. In fact, her nickname is Mossin' Annie, and she's the proud owner of Mountain Moss Enterprises. And what I love about books like this is you have a true subject matter expert acting as your guide. Annie will help you identify dozens of moss species, and she'll teach you how to propagate moss successfully. This is something most gardeners want to know how to do. And let me tell you, you want to learn from Annie instead of some of those viral TikTok videos, because so much of that stuff is just simply bogus. And sometimes it can be hard to tell good advice from bad. And then finally, Annie is a master when it comes to designing and installing moss gardens. This book is 240 pages of down-to-earth advice on mosses in the garden. And whether you're an experienced gardener or a newbie, you're going to feel extra confident about utilizing moss, the great green ground cover, with Annie as your guide. You can get a copy of The Magical World of Moss Gardening by Annie Martin and support the show using the Amazon link in today's show notes for around $13. Finally, we end the show today with a botanic spark that honors the memory of Napoleon Bonaparte, who died on this day, May 5th, in 1821. Bonaparte was the French military and political leader who ended up ruling over much of continental Europe. Last year was the 200th anniversary of his death. One account of Napoleon's final moments reported that he died during a terrible thunderstorm that, quote, shook the house to its foundations and would have alarmed everyone but for the all-absorbing tragedy of Napoleon's departure. In 1815, after his stunning defeat in the Battle of Waterloo in what is now Belgium, Napoleon was forced into exile in the South Atlantic on a little island called St. Helena. And a few years before his death, Napoleon became convinced that he was dying of stomach cancer. His doctor, Francois Antomarchi, the man that would take his death mask, prescribed, among other pursuits, gardening, specifically digging in the garden. And so, on the island of St. Helena, Napoleon briefly took up gardening, and he loved it. Naturally, he wanted everyone around him, except the ladies, to join him in the garden at Longwood, and he grew every type of vegetable that thrived on the island. He installed grottos, alleys, and paths, and he transplanted trees and improved the soil with manure. Now, when he worked, history tells us that Napoleon wore a loose-fitting dress and a straw hat. And at one point, Napoleon actually shot Count Bertrand's goat because it was eating his plants. In 2021, the historian Ruth Skur wrote a short but delightful biography of Napoleon, told through the lens of his interest in gardening and naturalism, and it's called Napoleon, A Life Told in Gardens and Shadows. Ruth believes that gardens were important to Napoleon all through his life. But at St. Helena in particular, he was especially motivated to garden when his doctor pointed out that he could create sunken paths to avoid the watchful gaze of his prison guards, which of course happened to be British soldiers. Naturally, it was mostly Napoleon's people who did most of the digging, and although Napoleon's experiment in gardening was fleeting, Longwood House still grows a variety of plants that were planted by the emperor himself. Now, in her book, Ruth also tells a touching story about Napoleon's brief return to Malmaison after his defeat at Waterloo. Malmaison was soothing to the emperor, and it was a place that was full of memories of his beloved Josephine. Her gardens were filled with fragrant roses and colorful blossoms like dahlias long after her death. The painter Pierre-Joseph Redoute was a favorite of both Josephine Bonaparte and Marie Antoinette, but it was Redoute's paintings of Josephine's flowers at Malmaison that are among his most beautiful works. In Ruth Skur's garden biography of Napoleon, she wrote, "The 26th of June in 1815 was a very hot day. Napoleon spent it at Malmaison, reminiscing about the past. He walked up and down with his hands behind his back in what had once been his personal garden just outside the library. He also lingered among exotic trees that Josephine always insisted on planting herself. There were honey locusts, cedars of Lebanon, apple trees, and tulip trees. He also visited Josephine's grand greenhouse and remembered there how she checked her tropical flowers every day. It was indeed a grand greenhouse." Well, that's it for today's show. Thanks for listening to The Daily Gardener, and happy Cinco de Mayo. And just a reminder that you have a standing invitation to join the free Facebook group for listeners of the show. The next time you're over at Facebook, just search for Daily Gardener Community, where you'd search for a friend and then request to join. And if you'd like more of The Daily Gardener, you can subscribe to the newsletter over at thedailygardener.org. And don't forget that you can also show your support for the show by using the Buy Me a Coffee link over at the website or in today's show notes. This is Jennifer Ebling. Thanks for listening to The Daily Gardener. And remember, for a happy, healthy life, garden every day.